A quiet cul-de-sac, golf carts parked along the curb, sprinklers hissing softly in the early evening light. And in the middle of it, a woman in a white tennis skirt is standing toe-to-toe with a police officer, jabbing a finger toward a modest single-story house behind her. "You need to arrest him right now," she says, her voice climbing with every word. "He is trespassing on association property. And if you don't do something about it in the next 5 minutes, I am calling the chief myself. He plays poker with my husband." Beside her, a man in a golf polo and visor stands with his arms folded, nodding along like the outcome is already decided. Like it's simply a matter of paperwork now. The officer doesn't move to make an arrest. He doesn't even reach for his notepad yet. He just says calmly, "Ma'am, I need you to take a step back and let me talk to your neighbor." She doesn't step back. If anything, she gets louder, listing off her husband's business connections, the country club board seat she's held for 6 years, a state senator she claims to have hosted at a fundraiser. She mentions, almost as an afterthought, that she's spoken to the police chief personally at a charity gala just last spring. Neighbors are drifting out onto their front steps now, a few already filming. What none of them know yet, not the woman in the tennis skirt, not her husband nodding along beside her, is that in less than 30 minutes, they're both going to be standing in the back of a patrol car, on the very street they were so certain would always bend in their direction. How does a couple this confident, this connected, this sure of their own untouchability, end up here? To understand that, we have to go back about a month, to a disagreement that, on the surface, was about something as small as a garden. The neighborhood sat inside a private golf community, outside a mid-sized American city, the kind of place with a gated entrance, a clubhouse restaurant, and an HOA so detailed it regulated everything from mailbox style to the exact shade of beige allowed on exterior shutters. Gerald and Patricia Whitfield had lived there for 11 years. Gerald had built and sold 2-car dealerships before retiring early. Patricia had spent nearly as long serving on the community social committee and more recently, an unofficial but influential seat on the HOA's landscaping subcommittee. Between the two of them, they knew almost everyone in local government socially, and over the years, that familiarity had quietly hardened into an assumption that when the Whitfields wanted something handled a certain way, it generally got handled that way. A few doors down lived Maria Santos, a widowed nurse who'd moved into the community 2 years earlier after her husband passed away. Her home was smaller than most on the street, purchased with careful savings, and she took real pride in maintaining it herself, including a small vegetable and flower garden she'd planted along the side yard, well within her own property line, fully visible from the street. It was a modest thing. Tomatoes, a few rows of peppers, marigolds bordering the edge, a small trellis for cucumbers that Maria had built herself over a weekend using leftover fencing wood. Nothing overgrown, nothing neglected. She was out there most mornings before her shift at the hospital, weeding, watering, checking for pests by hand rather than reaching for chemicals. It had actually earned a compliment from the HOA's own landscaping inspector during his last routine walkthrough, who'd noted in his report that the bed was well-maintained and tidy, language that would matter quite a bit later on. Patricia didn't share that opinion. She felt a vegetable garden, visible from a street, didn't match the aesthetic character of the community, despite there being no rule anywhere in the HOA's actual bylaws restricting homeowners from planting vegetables on their own property, so long as the bed was maintained, which Maria's clearly was. Patricia had, over the years, developed her own informal sense of what belonged in the neighborhood and what didn't, and a working vegetable patch, however tidy, simply didn't fit the picture she preferred. Patricia raised it informally with a few committee members first, framing it as a concern about property values. One member, a soft-spoken accountant named Linda, actually pointed out that several other homes on adjacent streets had small raised garden beds too, and none of them had ever drawn a complaint. Patricia brushed the comparison aside, insisting Maria's was somehow different, more visible, she said, though it sat no closer to the street than anyone else's. When she didn't get the reaction she was hoping for from the committee, she decided to handle it herself, the way she usually did. That decision is where this story actually begins. Patricia showed up at Maria's door on a Saturday afternoon, sunglasses perched on top of her head, a folder tucked under one arm like it carried some kind of official authority. "We need to talk about your garden," she said, without any greeting first. "It's really not in keeping with the community standards, and I'm sure you understand why that matters to everyone here." Maria, still in her gardening gloves, blinked in surprise. "I actually had the landscaping inspector look at it last month. He said it was fine. No violations." "That inspector doesn't set the actual standard," Patricia said, waving a hand as though the compliment meant nothing. "I've been on that committee for years. Trust me, a vegetable patch like this isn't something we typically allow to just sit there, visible from the street like this." "I'd be happy to look at whatever rule you're referring to," Maria said evenly. "I checked the bylaws before I planted it. There wasn't anything against it." Patricia's smile tightened slightly. "There's a difference between what's technically written and what's actually appropriate, Maria. I'd hate for this to become a bigger conversation than it needs to be. A little cooperation now would go a long way." Maria kept her voice steady. "I appreciate you stopping by, but I followed the rules as they're actually written. If there's a real issue, I'm glad to go through the proper HOA process to address it." "There's an easier path than that," Patricia said, already turning to leave. "But it doesn't sound like easy is really what you're going for today." "I'm just trying to do this the right way," Maria said, more to herself than to Patricia's retreating back. "That's all." Patricia paused at the edge of the driveway, glancing back over her shoulder. "The right way and the easy way aren't always the same thing, dear. You'll figure that out. Here's a question worth sitting with for a second. If someone with more social standing than you showed up at your door, speaking with total confidence about a rule that didn't actually exist, would you hold your ground the way Maria did? Or would the sheer certainty in their voice make you start second-guessing something you already knew you'd done correctly?" Maria chose to hold her ground. She thanked Patricia for coming by, closed the door gently, and went back to her garden. Patricia, walking back down the sidewalk toward her own house, was already dialing a number on her phone. By Tuesday, Maria had a formal notice in her mailbox, not from the landscaping inspector who'd approved her garden weeks earlier, but from the HOA's main office, citing a newly filed complaint requesting an emergency compliance review. The letter mentioned a possible fine of $150 per week if the unauthorized agricultural use wasn't addressed. Maria called the HOA office directly, the same inspector who'd walked her property before picked up, sounding almost embarrassed. He confirmed again that her garden fully complied with every actual written guideline, but explained that any committee member could trigger a formal review, and that process, regardless of outcome, would take about 2 weeks to officially close. That should have settled things quietly in the background. It didn't. Gerald got involved that same week, catching Maria near her mailbox on his way back from the golf course. His tone was friendlier than his wife's, but carried the same underlying pressure. "I'm sure this whole thing is just a misunderstanding," he said, leaning casually against his golf cart. "But Pat's not going to let it go easily. And honestly, it might just be simpler for everyone if you pulled a few of those plants back, made it look a little tidier. I know a landscaping crew that could come by Thursday, no charge to you." "I appreciate the offer," Maria said, "but I already went through the correct process before I planted anything. I'd rather not change something that's fully compliant just because it's inconvenient for someone else." Gerald's easy smile thinned. "You understand Pat knows people on the county zoning board too, right? This doesn't have to be complicated. I'm just trying to make it the easy version for you." Maria glanced down at her mailbox, then back at him. "I understand you're trying to help, Gerald. But I'm not going to change something that's already correct just because it would make things smoother for your wife." Gerald exhaled, adjusting his visor. "Suit yourself. I did try. Does that sound like a neighbor trying to solve a small disagreement? Or does it sound like someone leaning on connections to get their way, regardless of who's actually in the right? Is that a misunderstanding? Or is that a quiet kind of power trip, dressed up as friendly advice?" Over the following days, the pressure kept building in small, deniable ways. A complaint about Maria's trash cans being out too early. A complaint about a car parked in her own driveway overnight. Then a complaint claiming her porch light was excessively bright and disturbing neighbors after dark, despite it being the same fixture that had come standard on every house on the street. None of it held up under any real scrutiny, but each one took time, and each one added another page to the folder Maria was now carefully keeping, just in case. A neighbor 2 doors down, a retired firefighter named Walter, stopped Maria one afternoon while she was watering her tomatoes. "Word's getting around about all this," he said quietly. "For what it's worth, that garden's one of the nicest things on this block. I don't know what she's so bothered about." Maria thanked him, grateful that at least someone could see the situation plainly, even if it didn't change what was happening behind closed doors at the HOA office. "You know how she gets," Walter added, glancing toward the Whitfield's house. "She did something similar to the Petersons a few years back, over a flagpole of all things. It blew over eventually. These things usually do, once she moves on to something else." By the following week, the formal review had closed. The HOA's written decision confirmed once more that Maria's garden was fully compliant, properly maintained, and not subject to any fine or forced changes. For a few days, things went quiet. No new letters appeared. No fresh complaints landed in the community portal. Maria watered her garden on Saturday morning like always, chatted briefly with Walter over the fence, and allowed herself to think cautiously that the whole thing had simply run its course. But she kept every document anyway: the original inspection approval, the review decision, the string of dismissed follow-up complaints, organized carefully in a folder on her kitchen counter. Something about how quickly and confidently Patricia had dismissed real paperwork made her not quite ready to fully relax. She was right not to, because 2 houses down, behind carefully drawn curtains, Patricia hadn't accepted the outcome at all. She'd spent that quiet week not letting it go, but convincing herself that the HOA's decision had to be wrong somehow, that there had to be some way, some angle, to make this situation end the way she'd already decided it should. The following Thursday evening, a single patrol car turned slowly onto the cul-de-sac and pulled up near Maria's driveway. Patricia had called it in herself about 10 minutes earlier, telling the dispatcher that a neighbor had verbally threatened her during a property dispute and was refusing to comply with an HOA legal order. None of it was true. Maria had never raised her voice, never threatened anything, and had spent the entire disagreement simply pointing back to paperwork. But the responding officer, Officer Bennett, had no way of knowing that yet. An allegation involving a threat has to be taken seriously every single time, regardless of how quiet or upscale the street looks. Officer Bennett approached Maria first, calm and professional, laying out the nature of the complaint. Maria, visibly shaken by the word threatened, stayed composed and immediately offered to explain the entire situation from the very beginning. That's when Patricia appeared on her own front lawn, Gerald a step behind her, both still dressed for an evening out, moving with a kind of urgency usually reserved for something far more serious than a Thursday evening conversation with an officer. "Finally," Patricia said, walking briskly across the grass. "Officer, I want this handled tonight. This woman has been escalating a property dispute for weeks now, and frankly, given who we are in this community, I'd expect a bit more urgency than this." Officer Bennett's tone stayed even. "Ma'am, I need to hear from both parties and see whatever documentation exists before anything gets decided here. Who you are in the community doesn't change that process." Gerald stepped in, arms crossed. "You might want to double-check exactly who you're talking to before this goes any further, officer." By now, several neighbors had drifted out onto their porches, phones slowly rising. Walter stood at the edge of his own lawn, arms folded, watching with an expression that suggested none of this particularly surprised him. Linda, the accountant from the HOA committee, happened to be walking her dog past the cul-de-sac and slowed to a stop as well, watching quietly from a distance. Have you ever actually watched someone try to use their social standing as leverage with a police officer in real time, fully expecting it to change how things get handled? It happens more often than most people realize, and it almost never goes the way the person hoping to use it expects. Maria stepped inside briefly and returned less than a minute later with her folder, the original landscaping approval, the HOA's formal written decision closing out Patricia's complaint, and a printed log of every follow-up complaint filed against her over the past 2 weeks, each one dismissed. She handed the whole thing to Officer Bennett without a word, letting the paperwork speak for itself. He read through it methodically, page by page, while Patricia stood there, arms crossed, visibly impatient. "This is an awful lot of paperwork for something that should have been settled weeks ago," she said. "I honestly don't understand why we're even still discussing this. It says here the HOA fully closed this out in writing over a week ago," Officer Bennett said, glancing up. "Were you aware of that decision, ma'am?" There was a pause, the first real hesitation from Patricia in this entire story. Yes. I was aware of it. I simply didn't agree with it." "Disagreeing with a decision isn't the same as it being unresolved," Officer Bennett said, still even-toned. He flipped to the inspector's original report and read a line aloud, quietly, almost to himself. "Well-maintained and tidy." Then he looked back up at Patricia. "That's the county-appointed inspector's own assessment, dated before any of these follow-up complaints were even filed." Gerald's confident posture faltered. "Now hold on, she may have used strong language on the phone, but that's not the same thing as—" "I understand," Officer Bennett said. "I just need to sort out exactly what was reported versus what actually happened here tonight." You could see it settle over both of them. The slow, uncomfortable realization that, for the first time in weeks, none of this was heading in the direction they'd assumed it always would. Because Patricia had knowingly reported a threat that never occurred, in order to compel an urgent police response to a civil matter that had already been formally resolved in writing, Officer Bennett explained, calmly and without any theatrics, that filing a false report was something he was now required to act on. "You cannot be serious," Patricia said, her voice rising now in disbelief rather than authority. "Over a garden? Do you have any idea who my husband knows? I understand you filed a report describing a threat that, based on everything here, didn't happen," Officer Bennett said. "That's what I'm required to act on tonight." Gerald stepped forward, trying to recover the tone from earlier in the evening. "Officer, surely there's a way to handle this without—" "You're welcome to speak with an attorney," Officer Bennett said, not unkindly, but firmly. "That's exactly the process for a situation like this." Patricia looked past him toward the small crowd that had gathered on the surrounding lawns, the same neighbors she'd spent weeks talking to about Maria's unauthorized agricultural use, now watching this instead. For the first time all evening, she didn't say anything at all. There was no shouting from the officer, no dramatics, no raised voice to match theirs, just a calm, procedural process, unfolding exactly the way it's meant to, regardless of who happens to be standing on which side of the conversation. The neighbors on their porches stayed quiet through all of it. Maria stood off to the side, saying nothing, not smiling, not gloating, just watching a situation resolve itself the way it should have back at her own front door, weeks earlier. Did Patricia and Gerald expect this outcome when she picked up the phone that evening, certain that one call would settle things in their favor the way it always seemed to before? Almost certainly not. People who spent years assuming their name or their connections would always tip a situation their way rarely planned for the moment. It simply doesn't. In the weeks that followed, the HOA board reviewed the full pattern of complaints filed against Maria's property alongside the police report Patricia had filed. Linda, the committee member who defended the comparison to other gardens on the street weeks earlier, brought the full timeline to the board's attention herself, laying it out complaint by complaint, decision by decision. The board issued a formal notice reminding all residents that property disputes were to be handled exclusively through the established review process, not through pressure campaigns, and not through emergency calls to law enforcement. Patricia stepped back from her informal role on the landscaping subcommittee not long after, though the board never framed it publicly as anything more than a personal decision. Word got around the neighborhood regardless, the way it tends to in a community this size. Maria never asked for any of this to unfold the way it did. She didn't post about it in the community app, didn't bring it up unprompted at the next HOA meeting, and when Walter asked her about it later, she mostly just said she was glad it was finally settled. She simply wanted her garden, the one she'd planted carefully, maintained faithfully, and defended with nothing but patience and paperwork, left alone. In the end, that's exactly what happened. At the end of the day, this was never really a story about tomatoes and marigolds. It was about what happens when two people spend so long believing their name, their money, or their connections would always tip a situation in their favor, and what happens eventually, when the actual facts simply don't care who's asking. Maria didn't win this by fighting louder or calling in favors of her own. She won it by staying calm, keeping her documentation, and letting the truth hold up under pressure when it mattered most. Sometimes that really is all it takes. If you enjoyed this story, go ahead and hit like and subscribe if you want more real HOA and neighbor karma stories like this one every week. There's plenty more where this came from. Have you ever dealt with a neighbor who thought their money or their connections meant the rules simply didn't apply to them? Tell us what happened in the comments below. We genuinely read every one of them.